Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. For those of you who are new to the Council Town Hall, we are a nonprofit with the mission of informing our members and audiences about the most compelling international, national, and regional issues. We are a nonpartisan organization, and an important part of our program is that we enable our audiences to ask questions of the speakers and panelists to foster a more engaged discussion. We will be taking your questions in about 25 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions at any time. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, and she'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's program. Is India the next global superpower? With Aparna Pande, Director of the Future of India and South Asia at the Hudson Institute, and Derek Grossman, our moderator, who is a Senior Defense Analyst at RAND. Derek, it's so great to have you moderating today's program. Our audience is very much looking forward to today's discussion with you and Ms. Pande.
Well, thank you, Kim, and it's great to be back on the program, as it were, here. And I want to welcome Aparna Pande, and I want to first congratulate you on your book, Making India Great: The Promise of a Reluctant Global Power. We can have a brief discussion about the book, and then we're going to turn it over to Jessica to take some Q&A from our online audience. Okay, so just want to ask, so right out the gate, so one of the things that you mentioned in the book is that the approach that India is using to realize its vision needs more than just planning for economic growth. It requires a shift in attitude. So I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about what India is doing right now and what that shift might look like in the future, and how can India implement that shift?
Thank you, Derek. It's a pleasure to be with you. So what I mean by that is that if India's always wanted to be a great power. India's always believed that India will be a global power one day. And therefore, but there's a presumption by and large that it's inevitable that because India is a 5,000-year-old civilization, because India is building its economy, because a large number of countries in the world would like the democracy to be a global power, a democracy which can actually counter China's rise, that rise will be inevitable. There's also a presumption that, okay, maybe what we need to do is just economic growth. My argument is that if you want to be a global power or a great power, you need to plan. And that requires 20, 30, 40 years out. What the United States did when it became a great power, or China has done over the last few decades. And that requires sort of not just domestic stability, it requires economic growth of 6 to 8% for a few decades. It requires investment in human capital. It requires more than just platitudes with respect to foreign policy. And finally, it requires making Indian military not just a large military, but actually a big power military and projecting power in your region.
Yeah, and yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the points in your book is you talk about creating a great India. So I wanted to ask you, what does a great India look like beyond some of the things that you just mentioned, not only for the government, but for the people, the youth, the workforce, elders in society, and India's role on the global stage?
A lot of questions, but I'll try to answer each of them. So I think, so one part of the answer is that, there's always been a conflict within India about, what is it to be India? What is it to be an Indian? Is it to be, there are the two ideas of India, which I talk about throughout in my book, that is India Is it to be Indian that you are a secular, progressive, democratic state which is seeking its role on the global stage because of your historical, civilizational, and economic and military potential? Or are you going to be great by going back in history and by rewriting all of the wrongs which were done over 1,000 years of colonial rule and non-Hindu rule? So that's one part of the struggle which India has to deal with if it wants to be great. What does it mean to be great for the in the ideological context? The second part is, to be great, India would need to invest in its people. And if we just look at some figures, about 500 million Indians, India is one of the largest labor force, but only 5 to 7% of India's workforce is skilled versus about 60% in developed countries. So India has a large workforce, but not a very skilled workforce, which means that it'll be difficult to provide them jobs. And without jobs and employment, you'll have a large, primarily male workforce, which does not have jobs, and that will create social discontentment, not only just economic. Third, India does have a large military. India has invested in it, but India has not. India's belief in military investment is, when we have a challenge, we will deal with it. It's an ad hoc response rather than, you need to sort of invest 20, 30 years out. Fourth, education. India's literacy rate, yes, it's impressive. It is 74% today, sort of considering that at independence it was 16%. But Sri Lanka is 95%. Bangladesh, which became independent in 1971, is 72%. So India's sort of, if you compare it with some of India's neighbors, India has not done as good a job in educating its people. Healthcare, since we all still living through the pandemic and COVID-19, India's healthcare system, India has underinvested in healthcare. And yes, it can proudly say it is the pharmacy of the world, and India is supplying vaccines to a number of countries. But at the end of the day, India's primary healthcare system is not sufficiently geared to deal with the challenges of a 1 billion plus people. So it has healthcare, literacy, and then institutions like, infrastructure, urban infrastructure, water, sanitation. I hope I answered some part of your question.
No, I think you did, and thank you for that. Next question I have is, so Prime Minister Modi clearly is interested in returning India to some kind of greatness, and we can debate what that greatness is, right?
Yeah.
And so what kind of hurdles do you think he's facing, both internally and externally, to achieving that goal, which I think is, what your book is talking about, trying to make India great. So it seems like what he's doing would fit with that motif.
Yes, it would. But the challenges he faces, in many ways, the domestic and the foreign play into each other. I'll start with the foreign. India is sort of, under him for the last 6 years, India's diplomatic push has been on the rise. India sort of, built relations, deepened them with most countries around the world, not just in the West, United States, but also in the Middle East, East Asia. So done a good job in trying to convince people that India does want to play a bigger role, that please come and invest in India, help India's economy grow, let's build a military partnership. But at the end of the day, if corporations seek to invest in India, it will not be because their governments ask them to. It will be because they are going to make profit or return on investment. And unfortunately, over the last 6 years, India has gone back to a more semi-socialist, more protectionist, more regulations, model of economic growth. There have been almost no major economic reforms. The last major set of economic reforms in India were in 1990, 1991. So sort of, challenges he faces are that unless there are domestic economic reforms, there will be less investment coming in. So for example, some Japanese companies, American companies leaving China may want to come to India, but right now they're going to Vietnam, Philippines, and maybe even Bangladesh, but not to India. The second part of the challenge is, yes, the advantage that the 6 years have given is that there is one political party which has managed to win elections. So there's electoral majority of one political party, which brings stability of a certain kind. The problem with that is that domestic political stability is important, but so is social stability. And for the last 6 years, we don't see social stability. Attacks on, sort of minorities have increased. Attacks on the lower castes have increased. There's been a repression of, democratic freedoms. So there are those which sort of, those challenges which will hurt India when it tries to appeal to other countries for economic support and for support as being, because at the end of the day, this is my argument that, India's rise will be dependent on how the rest of the world sees India, and how does it view India, and the rest of the world needs to be comfortable with the India that is emerging. And by and large, the rest of the world has been comfortable with a democratic, politically stable, socially inclusive, secular India. They want India to do more, but sorry, Derek.
No, go ahead. Finish your point.
So that's so I mean, they may like a politically stable India, but they are uncomfortable with the other aspects which are coming to the fore. And on top of that, there's less economic growth. There's less investment in military. I mean, I'll just throw a figure out. For the last 3 years, 1.6% of India's GDP has gone towards defense, majority of which goes for salaries and pensions. So, there's challenges.
Yeah. To your point about India's rise will, to some extent, depend on how others see India rising, I wanted to turn briefly to the US-India relationship. Obviously, we're in the early days of the Biden administration. I saw I think it was yesterday, that the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, talked to Ajit Doval in India, his counterpart. And so, obviously there's dialogue ongoing here. But I wanted to get your sense of where you see the US-India relationship going. It seemed to be extraordinarily close under the Trump administration. Obviously, there was the Howdy Modi event in Houston, and then there was the return favor back in India. So should we expect that momentum to continue, or should we expect, due to a variety of reasons, that maybe it would stagnate or actually undermine relations?
So I think the relationship is strong, and I'm sure you'll agree that for the last 2 decades, ever since President Clinton went to India, there's been a steady India-US strategic partnership under successive presidents. Every president has traveled to India: Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump. And so I do see that the strategic dimension remaining strong. I sort of, there are, let's say, 3 broad pegs under which we can put the relationship: defense, economic, and maybe people to people or values based, however we look at it. I think the defense component has in some ways become the most important and the strongest foundation, interestingly, considering that India was never a military ally for decades, but today, it's a major defense partner. And I see that continuing. US relationship with India is both regional, but it's also global. And with the US-China peer competition and peer rivalry, and the desire to have countries and allies and partners around the world standing up with the United States, I believe the India-US defense partnership will deepen. More military purchases, more military exercises. Indo-Pacific still remains important. We have a coordinator in the NSC, and the Quad is still strong. So I think that part will continue. The challenge will remain on the economic and the values based. Economic is old again. Even under the Trump administration, if you recall, the friction used to come in trade. The desire that India lower tariff barriers, that India should not become protectionist, that India must purchase more equipment. There was no trade deal or even a mini trade deal. And India even lost the GSP plus privileges which you used to have earlier. The President Trump took them back or suspended them. So I think that will continue in the Biden administration. It will not be as in your face as it was under the Trump administration, but I think American concerns about Indian protectionism will continue. India data privacy rules and all of those will continue, and there'll be a desire that India, does more. On the other hand, there's a possibility India actually, the Biden administration may reinstate India's GSP plus, which would be a minor victory for India, and India may give something in return. But I don't see the protectionism sort of reducing from the Indian side, unfortunately. The values-based is where I am a little more concerned. And that's because of everything that's happening inside India and the fact that it's a democratic administration. It means that human rights, religious freedom, and minorities, will play a bigger role. So not just on the Hill, but I believe even the State Department will care more about what is happening inside India, in Kashmir, and even in other parts of India. So I see, but I don't see this derailing the India-US strategic partnership. I do see more questions arising in certain issues.
So we covered the U.S. side of the equation. Now, of course, the China side, right? So as U.S.-China great power competition continues to ramp up, and it looks like it's going to be very similar under the Biden administration as it was under the Trump administration. And China is testing the U.S. early on vis-a-vis Taiwan. And we may get some other tests in the coming weeks and months. So where does India see itself in that dynamic? Obviously, India has ongoing border tensions along the line of actual control, high in the Himalayas, and now potentially in other areas along the disputed borders. So, my sense is 2020 really was a year of reckoning for India, that even those who were, as dovish as could be on China in India are now saying, you know what, yeah, we have to increasingly turn to the US and increasingly to, partners like Australia and Japan and others to offset China. So where do you see the India-China relationship heading in the years to come? And how does that play in to making India great?
So I agree with everything you said. Most people who were dovish or on the fence about the about China have come more in the center. My concerns, however, are that yes, India is aligning closer to the United States. India is playing a bigger role in Quad. India is even participating more in Indo-Pacific. However, there's still I see as mild hedging or a balancing going on, in the sense that there's still a desire to manage the relationship with China without naming China. Without openly saying that China is the next. Yeah. Second, there's still the hope that high-level diplomatic engagement will convince China to back off and return the territory China has taken from India. And there's a reluctance to use the military. Now, I understand India's military capabilities are not as good as China's. We are nowhere there. However, and you know this better than I do, that Chinese state understands power. It understands hard power. It is not India's diplomatic engagements which will convince the PLA to move back. It will be when the Chinese state actually believes that India is a rival and India is a country that China should be concerned about, that there will be some change on the border, or they will they will at least stop pushing India every few months on the border. So while there has been some change in Delhi's strategic community, I believe the goal that is being followed, the policy being followed, is still by and large the same. That let us try and convince China that you don't want to lose the friendship of 1.3 billion Indians. You don't want to lose the Indian consumer market, and you don't want to start a war. That should convince Beijing to back off. And I don't think that policy is going to work as effectively unless you have a big stick behind you.
Yeah. But now and that's fair, but what about India-China competition within the subcontinent and in some of the the smaller South Asian countries? I'm thinking about Sri Lanka, Nepal, Maldives, places like that, where you know, this is obviously, this is not resulted in armed conflict, but it is about China kind of looping them into the Belt and Road Initiative, currying favor through infrastructure and investment programs, and possibly increasing its influence at the expense of India's influence. And this is India's traditional backyard. And so I know India's, you know, not part of Belt and Road Initiative, was one of the first, if not, I think the first to say, we're not joining that. So, you know, how does India deal with growing Chinese influence within its region, and how might that hamstring its aspirations to become a great power in the future?
So three quick things. First, if we just look at Chinese influence in South Asia, more students from all the South Asian countries study in China than study in India. After Pakistan, Bangladesh is the country which has the second largest BRI investment. All of India's neighbors have received money from BRI. Now, India's strategy traditionally was that, you know, we don't need to worry because you have no option. We are the largest power in the region. You will by default look at us. And so India ignored for a long time the Chinese economic and developmental and actually military presence, except for China, except for Pakistan, where India was a little more focused. With the other countries, India by and large ignored it. India has played catch up in the last decade or two. So, you know, this includes, for example, you know, purchasing or allowing goods from Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Nepal to be imported into India without tariff barriers. So, you know, on the economic side, developmental, like offering to build highways and ports, sort of, you know, at a lower rate and maybe as grants or lines of credit rather than, you know, the massive loans that countries would get through BRI. And so India has played, I mean, and now during COVID, actually, India has again done, you know, for example, India provided personal protective equipment to all of its neighbors. India has actually given vaccines, millions in vaccines to all of its immediate neighbors. And so that's how India is playing, sort of, you know, is trying to counter. But yes, there are challenges. With Nepal, actually, China is now interfering in Nepalese domestic politics. You know, and Nepal has, and Nepal over the last, I mean, last year, Nepal issued a new map in which it claimed additional Indian territory. You know, Sri Lanka, there's always been, you know, Sri Lanka's always in some ways played India versus China. Under the Rajapakshas, it's a little closer to China because of a massive amount of you know, elite corruption that took place. Maldives is sort of, you know, is dependent on India and the United States to help it resolve its BRI loans. So India is playing the game. India, I think, has realized that it needs to up its game, but its resources are limited. So in many ways, United States or Japanese assistance through ADB or Quality Infrastructure Initiative or the United States MCC, Millennial Challenge, all of those help India to sort of, you know, push back against China. But it's still, it's a game, and it's a long-term game that India will need to continue at because China has a lot more money to throw.
I thank you for that. I think we only have time for maybe a couple of more questions before we turn it over to Jessica for the audience Q&A. So I wanted to bring it back to your book and ask one question about, I guess, domestic events in India. And you write in the book, India has underinvested in its cities, its institutions, and most of all, its people. So the question is, how should India be preparing the next generation of leaders to help the country thrive in the fields of technology, healthcare development, and diplomacy? And are there areas that you see that are severely lacking that other countries have an ability to achieve, that other countries, you know, have a comparative advantage in?
So I'll start off with the last one, foreign policy, and I'm sure you know the statistics as well as I do, which is that India is one of the smallest foreign service corps in the world. You know, Singapore has more diplomats, Israel has more diplomats, Brazil has 3 times India's diplomats, and China has 6 times India's diplomats. If you sort of, in many ways, India has underinvested in the foreign policy institutional architecture. Unless you have more people, you are not going to be able to achieve all that you seek to achieve through foreign policy. 5 people cannot play the same role as 500 can. And so, on sort of, there's that part, which is that India needs more foreign policy, more people in its foreign policy. Coming to, technology and education, sort of my argument's threefold. One is basic primary level, but that is okay. That sort of, it requires more investment in primary education just to make sure that you have a skilled workforce. But above that, you need investment in higher technology. For that, you need investment in research and development. If you look at the global average, sort of most countries invest more than 2% of their GDP in R&D. China and Japan invest much more. India's is about 0.63%. Most of it comes from the Indian government. There's very little from the Indian private sector or from the Indian universities, which contrasts to countries like the US, where you have the private sector which is coming in. And so, this is one area where if foreign sort of multinational corporations are allowed to come in and invest, then I'll give the example. IBM has labs in India which invest in R&D. GE has labs which invest in R&D. Corporations which come into India will invest in research and development, and that will help build India's infrastructure, India's technology. But India needs to allow them to come in and incentivize their coming in and actually setting up offices in the country to build in technology. The third part would be to actually allocate additional resources. Some years ago, India spoke about India setting up centers of excellence in technology. That has yet to happen right now. I mean, so I would say my only quibble would be there's a lot we say, there's very little which we follow up on. And so maybe if we followed up on only some of those, we would be able to achieve some part of this, of the investment in the human capital, which is critical for India's future.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think just one final question for me before we turn it over to the audience. So you did mention India's vaccine diplomacy, but I'm wondering in the context of the pandemic, how do you think India has fared thus far in dealing with all of the consequences, unfortunate consequences of this situation, and how do you see it doing in the future, and how does that play into whether India can stay on pace to become a great power in the future?
So India's India has a number of cases, but not as many as considering its population size. The challenge India facing and will face going ahead is economic. COVID, the pandemic has hurt India's economy. The first time in 7 decades that India actually had a technical recession was in 2020. In one quarter, the growth rate was negative 24%. For the year, it will be negative, I think 8%, according to IMF. And even if, as per IMF projections, India grows at 11% in 2021, that still means 3% growth rate. So if India is at 2.5–3%, it is going to, and it stays that way for the next few years, it is going to be unable to achieve any of its economic or diplomatic or foreign policy goals. So India, the main impact is economic, and the government really needs to do more, either through stimulus or through economic reforms, or incentivizing foreign investment in order for because without economic growth, India cannot achieve anything else.
Yeah, fair point. No, thank you for that. Okay, so I really appreciate the discussion, and now I want to turn it over to Jessica to see if we have any audience questions, and yeah, we'll go from there. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you.
Yes, the answer is yes. Great conversation, and we have a lot of questions coming in. So several people are asking about the tractor revolution. So first question, do New Delhi citizens support the tractor revolution? And how important is it that women are demonstrating with the farmers?
So I'll take the second part of the question first. Women have actually been demonstrating with, a part of Indian protests going back to the Indian freedom struggle and the Indian national movement. So women are always there. In 2019, 2020, when students and a number of Muslim groups were protesting against India's Citizenship Amendment Act, there were a very large number of women, including elderly ladies who sat for a few months in Delhi, the streets of Delhi, to protest that act. So it is natural. The tractor rally actually dates back to India's, the reason is in a few months ago, the Indian government passed a series of farm laws. And so the protests are primarily from farmers, some of them from the province of Punjab, but some from many other provinces. And they want the Indian government to take back the farm laws because they believe the farm laws will hurt their economic and their future potential. So there is basically a conflict going on between those who believe that the farm laws should continue and the farmers and their supporters who believe it should not. So there were protests. They brought in tractors, and on 26th January, 2 days ago, was India's Republic Day. And traditionally, the sort of what happens is that there's a parade takes place, and part of the parade you can have tableaus. And the farmer groups were allowed by the Supreme Court of India to bring tractors as part of that parade. And so that is how it happened. But it's primarily a dispute between the government and the farmers about the farm laws.
Right, thank you. We also had several questioners asking about the population issue that is being addressed there. So is the population birth control issue still being addressed? And if yes, how successful is it?
Actually, India has done a very good job on the population issue, considering that, it did not adopt the Chinese policy of one child only by force. The Indian government's policy was it incentivized people and said, sort of have 2 children, have no more. And so there were economic incentives provided, and India's population growth is sort of has tapered. So India doesn't really have a population growth problem anymore. Actually, it's a demographic dividend today if the government can take advantage of it, because India's one of the youngest populations in the world, and its working age population will still remain very high for at least the next 2 decades. So it will have fewer people in the gray, fewer graying population, more in the working age, which means for the next 2 decades or so, if the economic growth continues, that will help, because you have 500 million working age population, which will continue till middle of the century.
Thank you. You touched on this briefly earlier, but historically, the world's great superpowers have controlled the most powerful navies relative to other countries. Does this matter in the 2100s? How does India's navy compare with the likes of US and China, especially as tensions rise in the South China Sea?
I'll say something and then I'll like Derek to also come in, because I know he follows all of this. So India is an interesting country in that it's a continental power, even though a larger part of its coastline is maritime. So it's because of historical reasons that most of the older invasions came from across Asia, because of its conflict with Pakistan, because of its border conflict with China. The traditional focus of the Indian military has been continental, and therefore the army has traditionally received most of the funding, most of the resources, most of the focus. The maritime focus is new. It's just about, I would say, 2 decades or less than that. The Navy is very good. The Indian Navy sort of, does have a presence all across from I would say, the Gulf right to Southeast Asia, but it doesn't have enough resources for playing the role in that large area that it seeks to dominate, which is the Indian Ocean region. And unless it can do that, playing a role beyond that will be difficult. So I'd say, compared to the Chinese and the American Navy, India has underinvested and has not put in as much into its Navy. But considering the very few resources that the government has allocated, I would say the Indian Navy has done a reasonably good job. I leave it to Derek too.
No, I think you've answered it very appropriately. I would just add, from the China angle, China now has the world's largest navy, right? So trying to outcompete China in terms of total number of ships, I don't think is on the agenda for India, nor should it be. I mean, India should try to find ways to prevent China from being able to conduct, military operations in the Indian Ocean region. And a lot of that, I think, is going to come down to competition over future basing rights. And India is already well out ahead in terms of doing that. I mean, you can look at obviously Indian territory, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, what they're doing there, which is right at the mouth of the Strait of Malacca, very critical strategic choke point. But there's ongoing competition in lots of these smaller South Asian countries where I think India has a pretty good read on what's going on there, and maybe even has the advantage in terms of countering that so-called string of pearls that China wants to create in the future. So I think a lot of it will come down to that. And of course, India has the support of the US, Japan, and Australia as it marches forward in that endeavor. So, a lot, I think, is to be determined.
This is why we love having people from RAND moderate our discussions too, because you guys just always bring so much to the discussion as well. So thank you both. Okay. On the topic of Pakistan, if India gains prominence as a superpower, what will be its objectives vis-a-vis Pakistan, a neighboring nuclear power and a Muslim state where a significant minority of Indian population is Muslim in an increasingly Hindu nationalistic state?
So I would say India's policy towards Pakistan has remained what it was for the last 7 decades with some minor tweaks, which is that at the end of the day, Delhi would be sort of, would be content if 3 things happened. One, that Pakistan was sort of, in some ways accepted that India is a dominant power in South Asia. 2, that Pakistan, the state, stopped supporting terrorist activities and jihadi groups which target India, especially in Kashmir, but even beyond. And 3rd, if they could go back to some form of a South Asian where, you have trade and other relations. Now, the last 6 years, there has been a minor change. Initially, when Prime Minister Modi came in 2015, he even dropped in on then Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif in Lahore in an attempt to restart relations. But within 2 weeks, there was a terror attack inside India, and since then, there has been, basically there have been no the Indian and Pakistani prime ministers have not met since December 2015. And India's argument is first stop terrorist activity and then we will have a conversation. Pakistan's ends up being first talk about Kashmir and then we will have a conversation. So I don't see that changing anytime in the near future. The additional part which is added on to it is Afghanistan, where India has close relations with Afghanistan, and Pakistan sees that as a Indian-Afghan pincer movement to break up Pakistan. But going ahead, I don't see any sort of any changes in how the Indian state views Pakistan. Yes, there's been a rise in Hindu majoritarianism in India. But at the end of the day, the policy towards Pakistan is based on terrorism and terrorist activities. Until Pakistan acts on that, I don't see that changing.
Thank you. What will the foreign policy of a great India look like? In particular, how do you evaluate the argument that India is willing to engage in various strategic partnerships and minilaterals with other states, including the US, while it is rising, but will abandon those relationships and revert to strategic autonomy when it reaches the top tier?
I guess what I would say is, at its core, India's foreign policy and India's foreign policy elite seek a multipolar world, and they seek a multipolar Asia. India will be most comfortable when there are a number of countries, none of which can dominate the world, because that ensures that India can play a role. If it's a unipolar world or a bipolar world, India will never be one of those poles. India knows that because it doesn't have the capabilities as yet. So that is what India's goal is, a multipolar world where India is one of the poles and can therefore help sort of play a role as a great power or a global power and sort of ensure that it keeps its interests. 2, when it comes to, and so it will continue with its minilaterals, its strategic alignment with the United States, It's the participation in Quad and Indo-Pacific. All of those will continue because they help India play a role and continue to remain important. Third, strategic autonomy will really not go, because at the end of the day, it comes from, I mean, it's something which is cultural or civilizational, just as non-alignment was. The basic core is, as a post-colonial country, a country which believed that during 200 years of colonial rule, India could not make decisions on its own. There is an underlying presumption that no other country or institution should tell India what India can or cannot do, and India must take decisions independently. So even if India agrees with another country, India needs to be able to say that we are taking this decision in Indian interest, not because country X wanted us to do so. So I don't see strategic autonomy disappearing anytime. I see it staying there, and it will demonstrate itself in, I'll give one example, the fact that India prefers to purchase military equipment from a number of suppliers rather than only one. So despite close relations with the US, India will continue to purchase from France and Israel and other countries. India, it will be sort of, I mean, I really don't see the time when India will only purchase from one country. It learned the lesson during the Soviet Union. And the Cold War, when its dependence on Soviet Union, Russia created problems. Even then, it used to purchase from France. It wasn't just Soviets. So I think all these three will remain, and so India will be, in some ways, India will continue to do what it is doing, even if it becomes great and global. The final point I'll make is there's something very similar to both the US and India. At our core, neither country wants to be pulled out into the world unless it really wants to. There's a semi-isolationist streak there, that we only get involved in the world or only want to be part of the world when it is our interests. So that semi-isolationist streak of India, which doesn't really want to be pulled out into the world or forced to play a role outside of its immediate neighborhood, will remain as well.
Thank you. Just following up on that comparison between India and the US, is India's democracy expected to conform to a US subscribed view of Western liberal values? Is that a more myopic view of expecting the world's largest democracy to bow into submission to Western values?
This is really the third rail here, huh?
Yeah.
I like it. I like that question. Okay.
Yeah, really good. So, I mean, I guess my answer will be yes and no, in the sense that what India has done over the last 7 decades is basically made democracy Indian, right? The argument is that democracy is not a Western value. So it's not like many leaders in Asia who say that democracy is Western. India's argument is democracy is Indian, because we used to have village level councils going back thousands of years. So we can talk about democracy being Indian. We can talk about parliamentary democracy being Indian. Similarly, issues of human rights or religious freedom are also not seen as Western. They are seen as Indian. The dichotomy that comes there is that India does not like to be preached to. And so while India India believes democracy and human rights and freedom are Indian, India doesn't like it when other countries tell India that India is not being as democratic as it should be, or not paying attention to human rights. So the problem will come in the fact that it is not that it is India views democracy as Western, but that India believes that democracy should be allowed to, go through their turmoil, and in the end, they'll come out as India would like it to be. So there's that tension there, which I don't think will go away, because at the end of the day, I believe it's a churning. It's in the Indian society and culture are churning, and we don't know which way it's going to come out. Is India going to become more democratic in the coming years? Is it going to become less democratic? I think we have to wait and see. That's the best I can answer it.
That's good. Well, we'll have you back in the future, and we can continue on that topic, see how things are going. Several people are asking about the issue of brain drain. So how does India plan on addressing the brain drain to the US, UK, and other countries? And another questioner said, why is India allowing the export of its highly trained people, such as physicians and engineers?
So this has changed over the decades. Till the 1990s, the brain drain was mainly one way. So it was Indians leaving India because there wasn't much scope inside India. So if you were a doctor or an engineer, you left the country because you didn't have the institutions, you didn't have the infrastructure which welcomed you. And so a lot of them came to the US, Canada, Europe, many places. From the 1990s till about 2010 or 2012, there was a reverse brain drain. Many Indians actually went back to India with the information technology, the IT revolution, India's economy liberalizing, opening up. And so many went back, became entrepreneurs, startups, they invested. In the last few years, unfortunately, there has again been a brain drain out of India, and that has to do more with the democratic and social tensions which are taking place, so many people believe. But at its core, India has, India underinvested, as I mentioned earlier, in primary education, but it invested a lot in tertiary education. So India has, great universities and institutes for medicine, information technology, engineering, but it doesn't have the capacity to hire all those people. And so most of them got better offers outside the country. If India actually invested in human capital and actually set up more institutes and actually provided the resource and funding, more Indians would stay in the country. So I think it's a question of the government never really looked at human capital and investing in education and actually, incentivizing its own people as sort of, like the US, what the United States capability comes from the fact that people from all the world over want to come here. I came to this country to do a PhD. Because this is the best, still think is the best country to do a PhD or a doctoral studies, including in social sciences. And so you have to create the environment to attract people and retain people. India has not been able to do that even for its own engineers, doctors, and medical professionals.
Thank you. What are the top 3 things India should do immediately this year, apart from COVID response, to set it up for great power?
I would say human capital, economic reforms, and planning, military planning. That's what I would say. Those are my 3.
Derek, do you have any others that you want to add?
Well, any other questions or anything to
sorry,
that
no, any other things since you were commenting on her suggestions?
Oh, no.
Okay.
No,
okay.
no,
I didn't want to cut you off and guess you're about to say something. All right. Why is it in America's interest for India to rise to superpower status? And is it in American interest for India to join the UN Security Council as a permanent member?
I'll start with the first one first. That's easier to answer. At the end of the day, it's an American national security strategic interest because the US does not have the money and does not have the military to police the world and may not have the desire to police the world. But the US would like to retain American preeminence and would like to ensure that China does not dominate the world. And if you want, and so you need allies and partners. And there's one country which is a rival of China, which sits on China's border, has the same population as China does, and has the potential to become a global player, and that is India. So it is in many ways, it's a democracy, its strategic interests align with the United States. It doesn't really have any conflicts, territorial or ideological, with the United States. And so in many ways, it's the ideal partner or ally. It's a little hesitant and a reluctant partner and ally, but it is the ideal partner and ally, and it ties into American interests. Now, the second part of the question, I think it is, symbolically, it benefits the United States to push for India being on the UN Security Council. But at the end of the day, we all know that, as long as there are 5 permanent security members who have veto, there is little likelihood of India becoming a UN Security Council member, because China will never allow it. China will not allow India or Japan to join. But I do believe that the other 4, including the United States, should support, because it's sort of, if India ever does manage to sit on the UN Security Council, its votes will be on the American side, not the Chinese.
Thank you. Did the monetary reform about 5 years ago work? Has India moved away from a cash economy?
No and no are the short answers. The demonetization actually hurt the Indian economy. And so the 3 points here. One, India was about, at that time, India's sort of about 83 or 84% cash economy. It still remains around an 80% cash economy. And that primarily is because most of India's economy is unorganized. So you have these small mom and pop stores, you have these real small enterprises, and they primarily work through cash. And what demonetization did was it removed cash from the circulation without providing enough cash in to replace it. It created a system which it is very difficult for a small, unorganized, or a mom and pop store to actually become part of the system in order to benefit from it. So it hurt the economy. The economic growth, which slowed down at that time, actually, came down. So I'll give the best example I'll give you is in 2014, India's economic growth was around 7-8%. After demonetization, it came down to 4 or 5%. It came down to 2% pre-COVID. So the economy did not recover post demonetization. And so it did not really help India's economy, and the sort of the long-term consequences have been devastating.
Thank you. What is India doing in its part to curb greenhouse gas emissions and efforts in climate change?
So Delhi would say we are part of the Paris agreements. India has long championed sort of climate change. India has India has pushed for solar, water, sort of hydel power, solar, water, as well as wind energy. Indian the government and most local and state governments have tried to convert many buildings so that they can use solar energy, which is quite advantageous in India. India's sort of challenges there are that its desire to be, its protectionism and its desire for self-sufficiency means that India produces solar cells, which are not as cheap as cells from United States or other countries. So there are areas where India can benefit by actually importing some of this technology from other countries, maybe in the West, not from China, which would help its goals. India does have ambitious goals. The other challenge is air pollution. I mean, COVID sort of demonstrated how India could actually Delhi's air could be breathable just because people were staying at home and there were no cars on the streets. But that's not the way to move ahead. So India will need to find a way to deal with its air pollution, its water pollution challenges. Traditionally, India's argument has been that the developed world led to the carbon emission problem and the climate change problem. So the developed world must compensate the developing world. I don't know how far that is going to work when India's economy rises and India wants to be a global player. But India does need to invest a lot more to to get over the climate issues it's going to face in the coming decades, like glaciers melting, less water or floods, air pollution, water pollution, all of these will challenge India in the coming years.
Thank you. This will be my final question then, Derek. I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you both. You have identified many things in economics, education, research, diplomacy that you feel that India has not approached properly. What do you think accounts for these deficiencies? Culture, politics, other factors? And how do you think India goes about changing these attitudes and lack of action? Also, how does India's attitude towards women impact India? So, long question.
Yeah, very long question. I would say sort of in each of these, in some cases it is cultural, but in some cases it is just misgovernance or, lack of planning and lack of strategizing that, if sort of, for example, human capital, if you want people educated in the next 20, 30 years, you need to plan for 20, 30 years. If you want to build a military and be a great power, you need to plan out 30 or 40 years. Economics, sort of, you're supposed to again plan and strategize if you want to ensure that you have 6 to 8% economic growth. Partly they are cultural, whether it's economics or others. I mean, I believe that part of India's problem on the economic front is cultural. There's a, I don't believe Indian society actually understands wealth generation or the concept of wealth generation. And sort of there's a disdain towards market economics, and therefore there's a problem India has in actually growing economically. But sort of, overall, I would say lack of planning and strategizing for the future. 2, more ad hoc responses than strategic and long term. And 3, the belief that just because we are, we will be. Just because we believe we are a future global power, we will inevitably reach there without us having to understand the challenges that we face. The women issue is again cultural, and it's sort of, it's problematic. And I'll give you just one example because we are running out of time. The sort of the global female labor force, percentage normally is 40% in any country. India's is 22%. There are fewer women in the workforce in India today than they were in the 1990s, percentage-wise. And that's a challenge India will have to rectify if it wants to be a global power.
Dr. Pande, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. Derek, I'm going to turn this back over to you. Thank you.
Well, yeah, just thanks again, and congratulations on the book. I urge everyone to pick it up. It's Making India Great, The Promise of a Reluctant Global Power, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kim McCleary for some final words. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Pande and Derek, thank you so much for your expertise and your time today. This was such an informative conversation. We must have you back so we can continue this dialogue. This was so informative. For our audience, we are going to continue these live streams throughout 2021 with a strong lineup. We'll try to bring our in-person programs back as soon as it's safe to do so. And we are providing these live streams for free as a public service. So please consider making a contribution to help us cover our production costs. You can simply text the word GIVE to the number on the screen. Also, if you're not a member of the World Affairs Council Town Hall, please consider joining. We have a whole list of benefits on our website, so you can check that out there. I just want to highlight some of our upcoming programs. We seem to be adding more and more every day. Later on this afternoon, our Young Professionals program is doing a program on globalization after 2020, reset or retrench. Of course, next week, politics in the time of coronavirus on Tuesday. On February 4th, building national security in an unstable world with former FBI Assistant Director. On the 10th, we just posted this. We're working with the top physicians and medical experts at Cedars-Sinai, and we will be presenting a program on the newest threat to COVID-19 through the variants that are popping up throughout the world. On the 12th, we have a high school program where we have discussions for them as part of their civic education. This program will focus on how Gen Z can shape the future of technology. So please share with your favorite millennials if they're interested in robotics or digital storytelling or the whole future of technology. And finally, February 19th, Bill Gates will be our guest talking about his book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And we've just named the moderator of that program, which will be award-winning actor Don Cheadle. So please go to our website at lawacth.org and register today, become a member, make a donation. Everybody stay safe, stay informed, and we hope to see you next week.